It was Tuesday, and for my next plan to work, the Kozuki organization needed to be ready by Saturday. We had 4 days. 4 days to get Suichiro and Chihiro up to scratch. To get the pipe bombs from Masahara. 4 days until the market. Ino had been pulling double duty lately as both the organization's logistics officer and as something of an intelligence officer. I recognized it was outside of her core competencies, not to mention the scope of her role as quartermaster, but so far she'd managed to pull through while still doing most of the legwork to keep the Rising Sun Benevolent Association moving. I'd been very impressed by the depth of her knowledge when she and Ogi had briefed me on the Shinjuku black market scene, so 2 days ago I had asked her to find out where the next weekly gang-hosted market would be hosted, and by whom. Only a single day later, she'd arrived at Ogi and Naoto's apartment and briefed me. It's such a pleasure to have competent co-workers. Apparently, the Kokurikai, freshly victorious over a pair of smaller street gangs, were hosting the next market on the coming Saturday, in the ruins of the Shinjuku Gyomei station. As per normal, the hosting gang would guarantee the safety of the attendees and provide security, and would get to charge a gate fee plus a tax on all business conducted during the market. Hosting these markets, according to Ino, was of incredible importance to the gangs because it gave them both a source of funding and a chance to get first pick of the wares, as well as prestige with their competitors. It was also a way to show off to potential employers, as frequently representatives from out-of-town criminal syndicates and factors for various shady Britannian interests would attend. Of particular interest to me was the fragility of the foundation of this new, rising gang. The Kokurikai had just swallowed up a significant amount of territory, proving their strength, but were still in the process of fully consolidating their new conquests. The consolidation process had temporarily diluted their ability to project power or actively defend all of their territory. This combination of a bloated portfolio of holdings coupled with an apparent inability to vigorously fight off challengers had led other gangs to smell blood in the water, and small skirmishes had already been fought as rival gangs probed for openings. As a result, the Kokurikai had volunteered to host this market as a display of strength and prestige, which meant that anything going wrong would confirm the impression of weakness and had the potential of kicking off a new round of gang warfare. To sweeten the pot even further, the particular focus of this market would be arms and ammunition sales. Each week, the various gangs typically hosted markets that had particular focuses. That way, buyers could easily connect with vendors carrying the goods they were looking for, and could compare the various wares at hand. Having these focused markets also made things easier for the various gangs and independent players that were selling products. Catering to specific markets would make it easier to tailor their inventories, and would give vendors the opportunity to gather intelligence on their competitors. While weapons wouldn't be the only wares available, there would be an abundance of arms and ammunition that could be seized and added to our growing arsenal, not to mention the Britannian currency and drugs that the gangs used as their preferred mediums of exchange. I had honestly been surprised to learn how structured the Shinjuku underworld was, at least in this way, but I supposed it made business easier for everybody to have common, centralized exchanges with mutually understood rules. Fortunately for us, this underground infrastructure also made it possible to attack a medium to big street gang by essentially pinning them down in a vulnerable spot, at a defined location and time, giving us the opportunity to prepare the ground and tactical approach well in advance. While risky for a number of reasons, a successful attack on one of these markets could lead to all kinds of possible benefits for our organization. Besides the possible spoils, the market was an ideal target because it presented a potential mass casualty opportunity with a minimum of collateral damage. This wasn't a public market, it was invite-only, so the only people likely to be in attendance were gangsters or people who had gotten in bed with gangsters. It also was neither a slave market nor a brothel, so we wouldn't need to worry about hostages being caught in the crossfire. Everyone who attended that market would be a fair and easily justifiable target, and everything we took would be a legitimate spoil of war. An ideal operation for a rebel organization that had yet to be truly blooded. Of course, there would be repercussions for an attack like the one I was planning, and I had no intention of letting any of the fallout touch the Kozuki organization. We were too small in number to truly fight the gangs, so I'd have to find a scapegoat to pin the responsibility for this attack on. Done correctly, the infuriated gangs would blame whoever I chose as our fall guy, and our cell would remain unknown and unconnected to the attack. Ideally, The gangs would blame and attack each other, causing further chaos to ripple out into the ranks of my enemies and sowing the seeds for future false flag attacks. And so, 4 days of intense preparation began. Or, at least, intense preparation for some. Naoto, along with Ino and Tamaki, took over the task of operating the Rising Sun Benevolent Association's day-to-day work. Those lucky bastards spent the 4 days engaged in productive and constructive work, handing out food and filling in potholes. After I'd filled her in, Callan had agreed to keep an ear open at Ashford, and had found a potential scapegoat to offload responsibility onto in the form of a Lord Kuel Sorsai. A captain in the Britannian Nightmare Corps, Lord Kuel was freshly transferred from the Britannian homeland to Area 11 and had already gained a prickly reputation, according to the daughter of a Britannian officer who enjoyed playing tennis and had a habit of blabbering whenever she was on the court. Apparently, Lord Kuel was a minor unlanded and untitled noble, a member of a small cadet branch of a dynasty that controlled the area around what had been Quebec in my first life. More importantly, Kuel was a member of a faction of the Britannian military known as the Purists, who apparently were dogmatically racist even by the standards of Britannians. Their central plank seemed to be a general disdain for numbers, and they supported efforts to drive honorary Britannians and Britannians of mixed heritage out of the military. The faction the man represented was known for casual violence, ham-handed tactics, and for going off the reservation on independent missions without bothering to seek approval from the official chain of command. Combined with the man's rumored haughty personality and penchant for explosive violence, Kuel would be an ideal scapegoat. As soon as Callan let me know about him, I had her start typing up an official notice from the Purist faction claiming responsibility for the attack upon the subhuman criminal gathering, and claiming that the attack was retaliation for the robbery of a Britannian military storage facility. The notice ended with Lord Kuel Sorsai's name, printed at the bottom and identifying him as the local head and spokesman for the Purist faction. Callan had even managed to find a copy of a press release the Purists had published a few years ago denouncing the appointment of an officer of mixed heritage to command the Buenos Aires garrison, and had managed to edit her fraudulent notice to have the same style and appearance as the press notice. While it still wouldn't look like the real deal to anybody with much first-hand experience with military or legal documentation, I was positive it would dupe at least some of the dumber gangsters. Between coordinating all the other efforts, Ogi and I trained Chihiro and Suichiro as best we could. Personally, I wasn't expecting much from them this time around, not because either lacked the passion or desire to fight, they were both hateful battle maniacs lusting for violence, but because a few days of training just wasn't enough to develop even a minimal degree of skill. Still, everybody has to start somewhere, and having 2 extra guns backing us when the plan inevitably went wrong could be useful. Ogi and I did our best to improve their accuracy and speed with the military surplus coilgun pistols, switching to the basics of knife fighting when the recruits began to flag and their shots started going wild, and leading them on short jogs when the CQC drills grew stale. Ultimately, while neither were up to the admittedly high standards of the 203rd, both made solid gains in the 3.5 days of training I was able to give them. Chihiro had already begun to pick up the rapid speed necessary for urban combat, and could draw, aim, and shoot her pistol in an acceptably short time. Unfortunately, her accuracy was entirely unacceptable. She tended to blaze through her ammunition, rapidly pumping rounds downrange but only managing 3 or 4 hits from each 13-round magazine on a stationary target before having to stop and reload. Suichiro, by contrast, could reliably get at least 10 hits on his target before reloading, but moved and aimed painfully slowly, far too slowly to be useful or responsive in real combat. Both were better at close-quarters combat, Suichiro benefiting from his police training and Chihiro drawing strength from her harnessed rage, but CQC tended to be of limited utility when your opponents were more than a foot or so away. They've got some good potential, especially your prized pupil, I remarked to Ogi, as we made our way back to the apartment after another long evening of watching our 2 trainees practice with their newly issued pistols. It's a pity we're having to shortchange them with this crash course, instead of some proper training. Ogi had looked contemplative at that, before asking me what I'd meant by proper training. What followed was a remarkably pleasant conversation about educational methods, as I drew on my memories of training the 203rd and floated ideas past him, and he proposed various changes or alterations inspired by his teaching skills and experience. He seemed to tend towards coddling his students more often than I'd have thought, considering both his personal inclinations and my vague memories of my primary schooling back in my first life, but we could both agree that the teachers from the Shinjuku School for 11s were absolute incompetents lacking any proper teaching methods. It was a nice break from planning bombings and the like, and I hoped I'd be able to focus on such constructive questions at some point in the future. You do? The shocked tone of the reply jolted me back to awareness, and I cursed internally as I turned and looked up at Ogi. I got too comfortable talking shop. I forgot who I was talking to. Of course, a battle maniac with a taste for inflicting pain would be shocked by my desire to add value to society instead of destroying it. I'm glad to hear that. I think you might make a good teacher someday, Tanya. My breath caught in my throat, and I realized Ogi was smiling down at me, without any obvious hint of recrimination. In fact, he looked proud. Of course, he was a teacher before he was a fighter. He has an eye for the future. That type of man is always happy to see people following in their footsteps. I wondered if he'd be equally enthusiastic about imparting every bit of his sadistic edge to his students as well, and considered bringing in someone else to help me train the new recruits. The last thing I needed was more sadists in our organization who would love nothing more than to maximize the number of war crimes we committed. No, he's too good of a teacher. Instructing the recruits is the best use of his skill set. Of course. Then he patted my head as we continued on our way, and I lost my train of thought as I forced his hand away from my already unruly hair. The bastard just laughed at my outrage, and I longed for an easily shelled pillbox to force him into. Nagata helped out at the Benevolent Association for the first day, before vanishing into Mr. Asahara's apartment building until Friday afternoon, returning to the hideout with a knapsack full of very well-padded and carefully packed homemade explosives. They were things of beauty, each about a foot in length, fashioned from steel water pipes whose exteriors had been deliberately roughened to reduce reflection and improve grip. Each had steel caps at each end, which had been carefully fixed into place with waterproof cork, sealing the explosives into the pipe and waterproofing the device. Each device also had a number stenciled onto it in black paint, from 1 to 5. Curiously, there weren't any obvious exterior detonators, which I asked Nagata about. First of all, here, take this. Nagata handed over a folded piece of paper. It's the numbers that will activate each of the bombs in order. Hopefully no telemarketer tries them. They'll detonate as soon as the call connects. He chuckled weakly at the thought, and shivered slightly. I couldn't really blame him. I could only assume that carrying a backpack full of bombs across Shinjuku that could detonate at any moment would be quite nerve-wracking. Anyway, there's about half of a disassembled phone inside each of these things, along with 300 steel flechettes. Mr. Asahara guarantees that anybody within 50 meters will die, unless they're behind cover, and anybody within 150 meters is probably going to die too. The Shinjuku Gyoenmei Station's 2 platforms are about 200 meters long. Well, I guess that's about as good as we can reasonably ask for, I replied, opening up the paper and checking that all 5 phone numbers were clearly legible. I suppose we'll just have to make sure they overlap. I looked up from the paper and smiled at Nagata. Good work putting us in contact with Mr. Asahara, Nagata. This plan wouldn't be possible without you. He smiled back at me, although he seemed unaccountably nervous. Of course he is. I internally scolded myself as I carefully tucked the backpack full of bombs on a shelf in the armory. He just carried enough anti-personnel explosives across a city to turn everybody in a block around him into well-done hamburger. I hoped his nerve wouldn't fail him when it came time for the actual mission, but I'd give him a break and not make him handle bombs again. At least, not for the duration of the mission. There's always tomorrow. And soon, it was Friday night, and time for the first active step in the execution stage of our mission. Ogi, Naoto and I had crept our way up to the top remaining floor of a heavily damaged office building near the station earlier that afternoon, and waited there as a handful of gang members had gone down into the station and rousted the colony of squatters sheltering from the bitterly cold winds in the comparative warmth of the tunnels. We watched for about an hour as the men 4 stories below went into and came out of the station, hauling garbage away and carrying a variety of collapsible tables and chairs down into the station. Eventually, the activity slowed to a crawl and the majority of the gangsters headed off down the street, presumably to find the nearest warm room to den up in with a bottle of rocket or 3. The lone remaining gang member took up a position in front of the tag plastered on the wall of the above-ground station entrance, the black circle and white claw of the kokirikai warning passers-by to steer clear of the otherwise inviting shelter from the wind. The guard looked like he wanted to take advantage of that shelter himself, as he huddled into himself, shivering as another wintry gust swept down. Presumably, his job was to ward off any wandering vagrants rather than keeping a serious guard on the station itself, as the eastern secondary staircase was left entirely unguarded. He was too busy shivering to notice a trio of bundled-up figures carrying backpacks cross the road a block down from his location, and so the first stage of the night's skullduggery was complete. It rapidly became clear why the eastern staircase had been left unguarded. As we crept down the filthy and rubble-choked stairs of the secondary entrance, I realized that the station was already structurally unsound. The ceiling had collapsed in several parts of the staircase, and we had to clamber over piles of rubble in several spots just to get down the stairs and into the station. When we finally reached the platforms themselves, we discovered that most of the southern side of the station, the old platform 2, had collapsed at some point in the past as well. The office building that had stood directly on top of Shinjuku Gyoemei Station had taken a major hit at some point, and during its collapse the southern and western parts of the station had been filled with rubble from the half-destroyed structure. The west end of the tunnel was equally choked with rubble, reducing the 5 original ways of egress from the station down to 3, 2 if you discounted the mostly blocked staircase. Fortunately for us, the tables and chairs we'd watched the gangsters diligently haul down into the station earlier were arranged around the center of the platform, just past the lobby where the shattered remains of ticket machines were still bolted to the wall. Even more fortunately, despite the many loads of assorted trash we'd watched the gang members haul away, the subway station was still fairly messy. It looked like every Japanese who'd sheltered here in the last 5 years had left something behind, and the reek of feces and rotting garbage hung heavily in the fetid air of the station. I could hear rats scuttling down over the old tracks and on the darkened platform, and smiled slightly. How nostalgic. It's just like the Rhine front, minus the artillery. Neither Naoto nor Ogi appeared any more bothered by the mess than I was. Naoto might be of noble stock, but he'd lived in the ghetto for quite a while now, while Ogi was just as much of a creature of the ghetto as I was, in his own way. Instead of commenting on the filth, the two men opened Ogi's backpack and began to unfold a collapsible ladder purchased by Rising Sun Benevolent Association. I'd never encountered that particular gadget during my first life, but as soon as I'd seen it in a catalogue of construction supplies I'd immediately added it to the purchase list. Sturdy and lightweight, the ladder would be invaluable for planting explosives in the one direction that I as a former aerial mage knew people always forget to look, up. The ceiling had once been metal panels, lined with lights and padded with acoustic muffling. Now, the previously hidden utility space gaped open for the most part, with isolated panels clinging on at various locations. Everything was coated in soot from campfires, torches, improvised ovens, and lamps. Much of the old lighting wiring had been stripped away at some point, as had some of the old fire suppression water distribution pipes, but plenty still remained to provide camouflage for Mr. Asahara's products. Using rough twine, we carefully hung 2 of the pipe bombs from the old pipes over the area where the majority of the tables were set up, roughly 30 meters apart. As soon as the 2 men had a pipe tied in place, I climbed up and carefully rubbed some of the same soot that coated the exposed plumbing over the twine and the pipes until they blended in with the rest of the ancient plumbing. After securing the first 2 bombs to the ceiling, we repeated the process in the antechamber room at the base of the main staircase, where the station office and turnstiles had once been. This area had plenty of heavily rotted acoustic tiles still in place, which made concealing the bomb itself easier but hiding evidence of our activities harder. After Naoto barely managed to catch a tile that unexpectedly crumbled at a touch, causing the damned thing to disintegrate even further, we had to spend a frustratingly long time policing up all the acoustic tile crumbs and rearranging garbage to hide the scuff marks where we'd been forced to use our hands to sweep up all the fragments. The final 2 bombs would be placed at ground level, concealed in garbage at either end of the platform area. Due to the rubble covering the northwestern region of the station, in practice the western floor-level bomb would be about 40 meters away from western hanging bomb, while the eastern floor-level bomb would be roughly 50 meters east-southeast from the eastern hanging bomb. The abundant garbage made it easy to conceal the pipe bombs, and at my direction Ogi and Naoto carefully used rubble to angle the devices towards the prospective center of the market. I added a further layer of rubble behind and slight above the bombs as well before we artfully draped garbage over them, hoping to produce something of a claymore effect and channel the majority of the blast towards the most likely enemy location rather than the ruined platform 2. If Mr. Asahara had been good to his word, and his estimations of the effective range of the devices were accurate, the market should be hit simultaneously by 2 vertical and 2 horizontal bursts of flechettes and shrapnel, with the guaranteed kill ranges of the 2 vertical spheres overlapping by 20 meters over the most densely populated area and the horizontal spheres overlapping with the edges of the vertical spheres. A few seconds later, the pipe bomb concealed in the much smaller antechamber should pulp anybody unfortunate enough to be inside when the detonator is activated, hopefully killing any guards drawn inside by the initial blasts, or any survivors fleeing from the main platform area. Of course, all of this relied on the Kokirikai being either incompetent or arrogant enough to not sweep for bombs again tomorrow morning, but I was reasonably confident that we'd hidden the bombs well enough to evade the disinterested and unprofessional gaze of whatever low-level gangster got stuck with the scut work. And so, Ogi, Naoto and I carefully policed up all of our gear and snuck back out the eastern stairway, taking care to leave the rubble as undisturbed as possible, and vanished into the night. The next morning, Callan knocked on the apartment door bright and early, come to drop off the claim she'd faked up. Naoto quickly ushered her inside, giving her a brief one-armed hug as she passed. After tolerating this for a moment, Callan squirmed free of her brother and made a beeline towards me. The radiant smile on her face was somewhat inappropriate, considering the bloody work ahead for us today, as was her vest, short shorts, and leg-warmer ensemble, but I couldn't resist returning her smile. This damned girl has enough charisma to raise an army, she and her brother both do. I idly wondered if the propaganda about the natural superiority of nobles didn't have a grain of truth. Perhaps the state social Darwinism is backed up with eugenics? I quickly shook the tangent away and returned to the task at hand, quickly reviewing the document Callan handed over. It looked just as good as the pictures she'd sent during the editing process, and far more authentic than I'd expected. This sort of above expectations work by an employee requires praise and incentivization. This is some good work, Callan. I began, warmly smiling at the older girl. All right, that's the praise handled. But how to incentivize her? What are her levers? Money was out of the question. I didn't have any funds of my own, and as a noble Callan already had plenty of money. Suddenly, the answer dawned on me. Respect and inclusion. She wants to be part of the cell, and not just as an intelligence asset. She's her brother's sister, she wants to kill and to conquer just as much as he does. I hastily considered her skills, aware of the precious seconds passing as my smile became steadily more fixed. She's good with her knife, and she's an accurate and quick shooter. She's athletic, and probably faster than me unless I pour all my energy into my enhancement suite. Overall, more qualified to help out today than either Chihiro or Suicairo, or Ino for that matter. Callan, you'll be coming with us on today's mission. Incentive delivered. Now I just had to fast talk my way through the reasons why a teenager should come along with us into battle. We'll need all hands on deck today, and you're a better shot than either of our 2 new recruits. Good start, but not enough. Naoto's not going to be happy about this. We're going to need as many people as possible to carry off whatever we can salvage from the market. I'll get another go pack together. The go packs were a number of canvas backpacks Callan had found in some warehouse, and thrown into the donated clothing for Rising Sun Benevolent Association. While prepping for this mission, I'd retrieved them and stocked each with a costume for the day, a knit cap, a pair of latex gloves, swimming goggles, a surgical mask, and the top of a set of hospital scrubs. The medical supplies had been smuggled into Shinjuku as part of the humanitarian aid, and would help hide our identities while being instantly disposable. We would change into our gear in the same Ruinogi Naoto and I had used as an observation post last night, and the empty backpacks would serve as containers for whatever spoils we could pillage. Absolutely not, Naoto yelled, before quickly getting control of himself and continuing in a quieter if no less fervent tone. Callan doesn't need to come with us on this mission, Tanya. He paused for a moment, clearly doing the same quick thinking I'd done to come up with reasons for my course of action. You said it yourself, she's a valuable asset at Ashford, and there's no reason to risk her safety here in Shinjuku. I began to reply to Naoto, but stopped. Do I really want to argue with my boss? As much as he might trust me, that's probably a step too far. especially in front of other people. Ogi looked acutely uncomfortable, his lips pressed together tightly enough to start going white, and Callan looked furious. Perhaps I don't have to. You're not gonna hold me back, big bro. Fortunately, the younger Kozuki didn't yell, so the neighbors probably weren't aware of the brewing spat, instead hissing her words like a cobra. I have the right to fight for my country too. It's all for a free Japan, everything we do. I'm not going to let you throw your life away for nothing, Callan. You're not Dad. Tanya said I was a good fighter, and she'd know. She was there when I had to fight, big bro. Realizing that this family argument was about to get ugly, I decided to try sweet reason. Callan, Naoto has every right to be concerned about you, he's family, and has at the very least an emotional investment in your well-being. He also has a good point about your value as an intelligence asset. Callan wheeled on me with an expression of betrayal, but I was already turning towards Naoto, letting my perspective drop into the emotional detachment I'd always tried to maintain during combat. Naoto, Callan has to come with us. Every other member of the cell is going to be risking their lives today. If you protect her, you'll mark her out as different. She will never truly be one of us unless she shares the same risks. Based on my 3 lives' worth of experience, I knew that people tend to prefer emotion to logic. Unfortunately for everybody, when push came to shove, most people would follow an emotionally fulfilling argument over a logically superior argument. However, I had first-hand experience with Naoto taking the logical path when it was offered to him, and he had a knack for surprising me by not taking the angry, emotional path that I'd expect from a terrorist leader. I hoped my calm tone and reasonable appeal would convince him to put aside his familial concerns. Naoto began to retort, looked from Callan to me and back again, and visibly swallowed his words with a sigh before trying again. Look, I get that, Tanya, but... Big bro. The anger had left Callan's voice, and she walked across the room to her brother, putting a hand on his shoulder. It's okay. You did a great job looking after Mom and I when I was a kid, but... I'm grown up now, you know? Naoto let out a wet sound that was half chuckle, half sob, and hugged his sister close to him. All grown up, huh? Callan. You're 15. You should go back to your school. Have fun with your friends. Enjoy your life, just for a bit. He let out another sob, and rested his forehead on top of Callan's head. You've got a chance. You don't need to be here. I wanted to look away from the emotional display, but I found that I couldn't. The prickling in my eyes and the sick feeling roiling in my gut told me that I'd caused this, and I supposed I had, but it was too late to take back now. Besides, I told myself, I was right. Callan is a good fighter, and keeping her safe on a shelf would mark her out as different. I might have been right about that, but I still felt like scum. In some small way, I'd just helped bring another child into a battle, just like the Empire had once done to me. Am I really so lonely that I'm willing to drag another child with me into the mess? Finally, the moment passed as Naoto spoke again. This time his voice was somewhat clearer. All right. I can see you've made your mind up. If I can't convince you to just keep being a spy, then I guess you can come with us. He put his hands on Callan's shoulders, and gently pushed her away. You'd better come home safe, Callan. If anything happens to you, Mom's never gonna forgive me. Sensing the touching moment was finally ending, Ogi and I quickly took the opportunity to grab our packs and start heading out the door, leaving the Kozukis to catch up. We'd all be meeting at the hideout anyway, and I needed to get gear for Callan and a pistol together before we could head out anyway. The Kozukis caught up quickly, and a short time later we met the rest of the cell at the hideout. Soon, Callan had an identical backpack as the rest of us, and we began moving in a loose strung-out group to our jump-off point. Everybody walked along quietly, trying to look generally unassuming as we passed through the crowded Shinjuku streets. I was pleased to see that nobody looked overly troubled by the prospect of what we were about to do, and refocused on the road ahead. It'd be bad to trip over a random cinder block and twist an ankle on the way to a mission. The hand that suddenly landed on my shoulder was a complete shock, and I was halfway through firing up my enhancement suite before I realized it was Naoto standing beside me. Before I could get a word out, he'd already begun dragging me to the side of the road, and after a quick moment of indecision I decided to follow him. No need to buck the chain of command immediately before we get to work. The conversation was as short and unpleasant as I'd feared. Tanya, My sister's going to risk her life today, and it's partially my responsibility and partially yours. Well, I'm glad he didn't blame me for everything. He's still the leader, after all. It's his call, even if I did open the door. You think in terms of missions, right? In terms of objectives, and goals, and all that? I know you do. Well, here's an objective just for you. Callan gets home alive, safe and sound. Hopefully in one piece. Got it? Just like every boss, the unreasonable demands always come. I'm not trying to get her killed, she's a valuable colleague. I'm not just playing around here. Look, you're a smart girl, scary smart, in fact. I've got no idea how you know everything you know, or do everything you do, but I don't care. You clearly care about other people, and you've already shown that you can be responsible. Take responsibility again, okay? This is your plan, and knowing you I'm sure it'll be effective. Just remember that a leader is responsible for the well-being of his, or her, followers. Got it? Of course I understand the importance of maintaining human resources. I'm not being just throwing people into jobs well outside their core competencies without consent. You're responsible for Callan today, okay? Get her home safe. I don't know what I'll do if something happens to her. I'd hoped he wouldn't feel the need to threaten me. I was doing my best to make sure everybody came home alive at the end of the day already, and I'd done everything in my power to advance his and his father's plans. Except I'd just potentially endangered their heir, the Queen-in-Waiting if Lord Stadfeld managed to usurp the real power of the Britannian administration of Area 11. In light of that, not to mention the stress all big brothers are stereotypically saddled with in regards to their younger siblings, I could easily forgive a threat or two. Damn it, why the hell did I shoot myself in the foot? I raged at myself, suddenly appalled at my poor decision-making. I'd impulsively invited Callan to join our murderous little adventure, and in doing so had squandered all the hard-won trust I'd built up. I should have just left well enough alone. Why the hell did I do something so stupid? For the first time in a while, I truly did feel my physical age. For my own stupid emotional needs, my desire to impress a girl I wanted to be friends with, I'd pissed away all of my credibility. All I could do is nod numbly to Naoto and slump back off into the crowd of humanity, no longer needing to mimic the typically dejected stance of the typical Shinjuku ghetto dweller. It wasn't until I was in sight of the building we'd be using as our jump-off point that I managed to get my head back into the game. I had a major act of terrorism to pull off and a market to raid. I could beat myself up over my stupid, hormonal, juvenile choices later. Alright, once more from the top, I surveyed the crowd of masked figures before me, nodding in satisfaction at how completely their features were obscured. Between the masks, the goggles, and the caps, even the incredibly distinctive Kozuki red hair was out of sight. Hopefully it'll be enough. Callan, Tamaki, and I will be Unit 1. Naoto, Nagata, and Ino are Unit 2. Ogi, Suichiro, and Chihiro are Unit 3. As soon as the bombs go off, Unit 1 will sprint ahead and hit the outside guards while they're still surprised by the explosion. We'll incapacitate them as quickly as possible and head down the stairs. Unit 2 will follow, and Unit 3 will ensure all guards are dead and communication devices smashed before following us. Once we hit the platform, Unit 1 will go left, Unit 2 will go right, and Unit 3 will give backup to whoever needs it. I paused for a moment, looking around to see if anybody's body language looked confused. Chihiro looked so fired up she was practically trembling with excess energy, and I decided to speed up the rest of my last-minute prep session. Wouldn't want her to go off too early. Hit anyone still standing first, and then make sure everyone on the ground is really dead. We don't want any survivors who can identify us or call for help. We take as much as we can carry, starting with Britannian currency and other money makers, then ammunition for the assault rifles, ammunition for the pistols, and finally any intact weapons you can stow in your backpack. We'll head up the east stairwell if it's still clear, or down the tunnel if not. As soon as we get away from the station, ditch the costume and split up. We'll all meet back up at the hideout. Another chorus of grim nods were the only response, any expressions of disgust or horror hidden away from view by the masks and goggles. Everyone barring Callan had known this plan for the last 4 days, but I was both pleased and appalled that nobody had questioned my plan. This was terrorism, and the execution of the wounded by itself was a war crime in the eyes of any civilized country. But this isn't a civilized country. This is Area 11, and Britannia killed civilization here 5 years ago. Alright, everybody pair up with a buddy and check your buddy's equipment. Take a minute and make sure everything's ready to go. Each of my urban insurgents was equipped with a small arsenal. Each had a 7mm coil gun pistol, 3 extra magazines, a knife, a flashlight, and 2 fragmentation grenades from that stash Naoto had stolen so long ago. Ino, Ogi and I all carried small first aid kits in our packs as well, not enough to save a life, but enough to stem the bleeding, hopefully. As the flurry of activity slowed to a halt, I moved into my final motivational speech, doing my best to summon my inner battle maniac persona to give a hint of sincerity to the presentation. Comrades, the word felt wrong in my mouth, but it seemed like the most accurate term for the other members of the cell. This is not the end for us or for our war, this is the beginning. We are taking our first major step against the vermin that gnaw at the vulnerable bellies and tender wounds of our families and friends, and who help the Britannian invaders in a myriad of small ways at the expense of our own. A pause to let them remember why we were about to kill these men and women. Everybody nodded, clearly on board with killing. Considering how much I'd hammered home that the gangs were parasites sucking the life out of Shinjuku in the last few days, that was hardly a surprise. I'm not asking you to enjoy this, but I am asking you to follow me. Do not feel sorry for these people, show them no mercy, for I promise that they will show none to any of us if this doesn't work. Every one of those criminals could have found a way to help our people, just as we have, but they chose to grow fat off the suffering of others. By removing the gangs from Shinjuku, we improve the lives of every single innocent trapped in this cauldron of misery by the Britannians. Ignore the fact that many of those gangsters had joined up just to get a stable source of food, and ignore the fact that so many of them were addicted to the same drugs they peddled to the rest of us. They'd made their choice. Looking at the 8 other men and women in the room, I considered giving them an out, a chance to back out with honor. Perhaps an opportunity for some flicker of respect for the common humanity of all to come to the fore, but quickly decided against it. Just like our victims, they'd made their choice to be here. I hadn't forced anyone to be here, there were no draftees in this particular trench, only volunteers. I'd only be insulting them and their Japanese honor by saying they could leave and I'd be happy to let them walk. I could feel Naoto's eyes on me as I continued. Don't worry, I don't want any of you to die either. Be careful out there. Watch out for yourselves, and for your comrades. We walk the path of righteousness, and I hope to have the privilege of congratulating each of you back at the hideout in a few hours for a job well done. I took a moment to look around, and meet each pair of goggles looking back at me, nodding at each of them. Internally, I mostly just felt numb. I was back in the company of battle maniacs again, well and truly. None of them had spoken out, none of them had so much as flinched. And just like them, I too had no choice at this point. I was committed, and there was no going back. The only way to my cushy position in the rear was to slog through everything the world threw at me until I could finally collapse onto a generously upholstered office chair. Under my sense of numbness, I felt a pulse of seething emotion, one I couldn't quite identify. But the thought of the flechets that were about to scythe through the crowded station below us made that roiling pool of emotion shudder with bestial satisfaction. Finally. I'm not going to be the victim. Never again, you hear me, being X? Never again. Naoto stepped forward, and I stepped back, conceding the emotional center of the group to him. He looked from face to face, goggles to goggles, and lifted his up to reveal his own eyes. He looked vaguely ridiculous, holding the swim goggles away from his face, but his gaze was serious, and I could feel the pull of his charisma just as much as every other person in the room, all unconsciously leaning inwards, waiting for what our leader had to say. First, let me say that I am very proud of each and every one of you. We've all worked hard to make Tanya's plan work, and it's thanks to each of your efforts that we're about to take a great leap forward. This is far and away the most important mission we've had to date, and it's going to change everything for us if we pull it off. I thought that was a bit much, but I could understand why such claims would pump up the members of our little guerrilla band. Everybody likes feeling important, after all, even though this small act of mass terrorism was small potatoes to actually fighting the Britannians. As far as pre-battle speeches went, I'd heard far worse. Vice's comment before the Legadonian invasion, well, hopefully we won't all die, holding a special place of shame in my heart. Unfortunately, Naoto kept talking and my satisfaction with his oratory vanished. We walk a righteous path, the path of the gods, the path of Kami. My stomach began to sink at the words, and a terrible premonition swept over me. Did that bastard reach out in Naoto's dreams, like what happened to Shugal? I craned my head, trying to get a clear sight of his face and cursing myself for the idea of masking up. Fortunately, Naoto's expression didn't appear twisted in religious ecstasy. He looked calm and collected as he continued his speech. Fishermen and Amaterasu are with us today, as we unleash fire and suffering on the running dogs of Britannia. We will bring a small piece of the cleansing fire of her sun down into Shinjuku today, and burn away the rot that bites deep into the bones of our people. This is a sermon. A sermon declaring holy war. Honestly, I should have expected something like this. People need an excuse to give in to their savagery, and while petty gain and personal beefs were enough for an odd murder or robbery, a bombing campaign presumably required something a bit more substantial. Damn it. I knew I should have introduced an ideological program. I'd hoped the outline of objectives I'd given our new recruits, coupled with the focus on providing for the people here and now, would have headed this off at the pass, but somehow religion had wriggled its way even into the agnostic minds of my countrymen. Gods are even harder to keep out than cats. But if this is what it takes to get them fired up, as long as nobody started proclaiming the glories of being X personally, I supposed I could swallow it as a means to an end. At least both sides won't be claiming the same God is siding with them, I suppose. After about a minute of further exhortations, Naoto wound down with a final message I could get behind. And now, let's make sure we can all go home tonight, and none of them can. For Japan. For Japan, we murmured back, no less fervent for how quiet we were. Finally, it's time. We left the building at speed, walking with a purpose as a group, moving straight down the street past the crumbling shells of buildings. Civilians took one look at us, at our hidden faces and clearly visible guns, and bolted. As the waves of people turning, looking, and fleeing began to ripple out, I raised my hand, the sign for Ogi, Naoto, Nagata, and Ino to press the dial button on their burner phones, calling the numbers they'd carefully entered into their phones as we left the building. Even from a block away, the sound was unmistakable, and immediately whisked me back to the Rhine. The sound was higher pitched than the detonations of artillery shells, but an explosion is an explosion. And 3, 2, 1. My thumb jabbed down on my own disposable cell phone, and the echo of a secondary explosion burst into the street as I shoved the phone into a pocket. As planned, Unit 1, Callan, Tamaki, and I, immediately drew our pistols and began sprinting. There'd be a limited window of opportunity to get in close before the surviving guards figured out what had happened, and we needed to get as close as possible before we opened fire. It's going to be all about keeping the momentum up. My heart thundered in my ears as my magic strengthened my legs, barely letting me keep up with Callan and Tamaki's longer strides. Up ahead, I could see two men with the typical scarves marking gang affiliation wound around their arms, both staggering around and holding their ears. The blast wave must have been channeled straight up the stairs, I realized. I wonder if they've been deafened? If so, it made my job just that bit easier. My first shot caught the further gangster in his right side, just below his floating ribs. Already unbalanced, he turned with the shot, pulled by the momentum of the impact, and teetered on the cusp of falling to the filthy street. Still running, I helped him along with a second shot that looked like it hit his sternum, but by that point my attention had already moved on to his comrade. Fortunately, my competent subordinates had skidded to a halt and opened fire a second after I had, and at least 3 rounds had hit the man. Within 4 seconds of the first shot, the 3 of us were already pelting down the main staircase into Shinjuku Gyome Station, Unit 2 hard on our heels. I could hear gunfire behind me, which I truly hoped was just Unit 3 was just putting a bullet into each of the guards' heads and taking their phones if they had any. Getting trapped in the station by gang reinforcements would be a hell of a complication. As we ran down the stairs, I fumbled with my flashlight but managed to switch it on, remembering the subterranean darkness of the station the night before. As soon as we reached the foot of the stairs, any doubts I had about Mr. Asahara's guaranteed quality were dispelled. It was hard to get an exact count of how many people had been in this room when I detonated the secondary explosion, as the flechettes had ripped through the close confines of the antechamber and shredded everybody inside. The reek of blood and feces from the ruptured entrails blended with the scent of explosives, and hung heavily in the air along with a thick cloud of concrete dust. Water pipes and bent girders swayed and hung down from the ceiling at odd angles, and above us the abused ceiling groaned and creaked. Clearly, the detonations of 5 pipe bombs were the final straw for Shinjuku Gyomei Station. My concerns about the structural integrity of the death trap we were hurtling into aside, we weren't alone in the ticket room. 2 gangsters, probably part of the guard detail from the entrance above, had their backs to us as we entered, one on his knees and vomiting, the other looking around wildly at the viscera splashed against the walls. Callan and Tamaki with their longer legs had reached the room just before I had, but hadn't delayed waiting for orders. Callan had immediately thrown herself forwards, knife flashing in her hand, and had already stabbed the kneeling man twice in the back of his neck by the time I jumped down the last 2 stairs. Tamaki had opted for the less flashy option of simply pistol whipping the standing man, who had turned at the last minute and caught the barrel of the pistol along his temple. Stumbling back and bleeding from a head wound, he tripped over the bottom half of one of the unfortunates who had been in the room when the pipe bomb had gone off, and landed badly on his right arm. I pumped more energy into my enhancement suite and sprinted through the room, heading out onto the platform, yelling "Leave them! Hurry!" to Callan and Tamaki as I passed them. Behind me, I heard Unit 2 reach the bottom of the stairs, guaranteeing that our backs were protected. And so, riding the moment, I led Unit 1 out onto the platform of Shinjuku Gyomei Station and made a hard left turn, into what had been the center of the Kokurikai weapons market less than 2 minutes before. One unlucky day on the Rhine front, the Francois mages had obtained a rare moment of aerial supremacy in a sector adjacent to my own. By the time the sector commander had called for reinforcements, the Francois had already had the opportunity to blast away at the recovery area a half-mile behind the secondary trenches for a full 5 minutes, raining artillery spells down all over the cowering infantry below. Making the situation even worse, the Francois unit had been commanded by an officer wise enough to quit while he was ahead, and by the time I'd arrived the Frankish mages had already retreated back across the lines. My unit was detailed to survey the damage and report back to the sector command, and I could still vividly remember the sight. It had been the first time I got an up-close view of what the aftermath of a mage raid on infantry positions unsupported by anti-air weaponry looked like. I particularly remembered the sight of a broad, shallow shell crater that had been used as an open-air mess hall by the units rotated back from the front. The Francois had detonated their artillery rounds about 20 feet over the heads of the surprised and trapped soldiers, and the explosions had essentially liquefied the 300 or so soldiers who had been eating lunch at the time. That was the only experience that even compared to what I saw on the platform. The overlapping cones of shrapnel and fluchets had done everything Asahara Hayashi had promised and more. Shreds of men dripped from the walls, and the few men unlucky enough to not have been killed immediately screamed and screamed, blood gurgling in ruptured chests and torn throats. The things writhing on the ground were all mangled and pulped, less men than horrible worms, studded with shards of bone and glimmering steel needles. How many had been down here when the bombs went off? 100? 150? For a moment, I couldn't move, the sight of what I had wrought like a window into some hell. If it wasn't for the lack of half-animal, half-human demons, I'd think that I was looking into the mind of Hieronymus Bosch. There a man had wriggled up against a wall, and was holding his own spilled intestines, looking at them with a detached marvel and seemingly ignorant of his missing legs. Over there, half fallen off the platform onto the old subway tracks, was an old man, his skin spotted with liver marks and his back shredded, as if someone had flogged him to death. At the center of the market itself, no bodies had survived intact. All that the steel rain of the fluchets had left behind was a pulped mass of bone, sinew, and meat, steaming and bloody. And then the stench hit. The blood and bowel smell of the smaller office was matched and exceeded 10 times over, and the reek of burning garbage and the pre-existing rot of the decrepit subway station blended with the heavy stench of spent explosives and terrified people. It was an overwhelming assault on the sensorium, and only my own long experience with death stopped me from dropping to my knees and vomiting just as the guard Callan had knifed had done. Enough. You've got a job to do. I slammed my eyes shut, and shook my head, desperately trying to reclaim my equanimity and detachment. Don't think about it, they were the enemy, and they'd kill you too. That's right. No mercy, that's what I'd said, right? Well, maybe I can give them a bit of mercy. I walked over to the man staring at his own guts, doing my best to ignore how my stomach turned as he fiddled with the loops of intestine hanging from his ruptured abdomen. It's almost like he's playing with them. He couldn't have been much older than Callan, and I could see his ribs, both through the skin of his exposed chest and protruding out from the deep gut wound that had disemboweled him. I shot him twice through the chest, and felt only relief as he twitched and gasped. Turning back to Callan and Tamaki, I saw that both were standing still, as was Unit 2. Callan had begun to shake, and Naoto had wrapped her in a hug. Gotta get them moving again. If they start thinking too much, they'll shut down. Hey. No slacking. I winced internally at my own harsh tone, but I couldn't take it back, nor could I find the emotional energy to control myself. Unit 1, we'll put the wounded down. Unit 2, start looking for anything usable. Hurry up, people, we need to be out of here in 5 minutes. As one, the group seemed to jolt back into the present, and slowly the cell members began to move. Their previous speed and precision was replaced with jerky motions, but hopefully that would start to smooth out as they got absorbed in their tasks. I wonder if there's any psychologists in Shinjuku? Considering what I remembered about the Japanese attitude towards mental health, probably not, but it was worth a look. It'd be a shame to lose anybody to untreated shell shock, after all. Myself included. After all, back on the Rhine front it was easy to rain shells down. I was just a tool in the Empire's hand. This, on the other hand, was all me. None of this would have been possible without my planning and coordination. Shut up and stop wallowing. They need a leader, not a little girl who can't fucking cope. You're the veteran here, act like it and stop being a damned victim. When did I start talking to myself like that? I idly wondered as I walked over to the next skinless halfman quivering on the grimy platform, the gang scarf still tightly wound around his left bicep despite the limb below the elbow being nowhere in sight. I don't remember when my internal monologue became a dialogue. Almost just a harangue. Is this some kind of lasting effect from the Type 95? That seemed unlikely, considering how I hadn't felt less interested in praising being X since the day I'd been born yet again. Hey. Tanya. Come here. Tamaki's shout from the far end of the platform startled me out of my stupid fucking idiotic self-reflection, and I hurriedly shot the wounded gangster twice in the chest before holstering my pistol and hurrying down the path, doing my best to avoid stepping on any pieces as I went. Tamaki stood at the end of the platform, staring at what looked like a gigantic statue of a man in the dim light of his flashlight. As I got closer and added the illumination of my own flashlight to his, I realized that the jasus belly Callan had put in Lord Kule's mouth in the faked message in my pocket amazingly contained a grain of truth. A Glasgow, a fourth-generation nightmare frame, the rapid-action Unit's 6-year-old me had marveled at during the conquest, stood in Shinjuku Gyomei Station. It was clearly Britannian surplus, with fading unit markings and a serial number still painted in white across its slate-grey frame. The cockpit, or pilot block, was open. The seat protruded, just waiting for a pilot to step up and twist the key visibly protruding from the ignition. Looking under the block as I approached, I saw the blinking orange light of a partially charged Sakuradite energy cartridge, indicating the vehicle was gassed up and ready to go. I wonder which gang was trying to sell the equivalent of a light tank? The eastmost floor-level bomb had clearly ended whoever had been standing nearby the nightmare, but equally clearly hadn't done a thing to damage the mechanical beast itself. I could see several scuff marks where flechettes had ricocheted away, doing nothing but marring the paint. Note to self, don't use anti-personnel weaponry against nightmares. We're totally gonna take it, aren't we? Tamaki chattered enthusiastically. Man, this is gonna be so awesome. I've wanted to ride one of these things for years. I was happy, if a bit disturbed, to see that any sort of stress he might be feeling as a result of the 100 or so dead bodies scattered around us was no match for his enthusiasm. I never would have pegged Tamaki for a mecha otaku, just goes to show how important it is to keep an open mind. Unfortunately for Tamaki, I was fairly certain this thing was a poison chalice. No need to crush his hopes and dreams, though, so I'd walk him through the cons to try and temper his giddy joy. Well, I'm not sure. Tamaki, got any ideas where we'd store the thing? He reluctantly turned away from the nightmare and towards me, brow furrowed with thought. In the subway tunnels? Pretty sure there's one near the hideout. The same tunnels we'd be using to steal the thing from the gang, and the way they presumably smuggled it into Shinjuku? The question was rhetorical, and we both knew it. Wouldn't that be the first place you'd look if you knew somebody had stolen the war machine you were trying to sell? Tamaki had no response to that one, but I could tell he still hadn't quite let go of the idea entirely yet, so I continued. How would we keep it operational? We'd need a supply of spare parts, energy cartridges, and ammunition. We'd also need to find someone who knows how to maintain and repair nightmares. The Britannians are incompetent, but surely they'd pay attention to anyone asking about nightmare parts. Tamaki began to droop, and I reached as high on his back as I could reach to administer a friendly pat in consolation. Oh, a nightmare. What the hell's that doing here? I turned, hand still raised, and nearly ran into Callan, who had apparently followed Tamaki's shouting too. Her goggles were up on her forehead, and her eyes were wide and fascinated, glued to the contours of the nightmare's frame. The beam of her flashlight followed her gaze, tracing over the elongated head of the machine before following the bulging chest of the pilot block down past the blinking diode of the energy cartridge. Internally, I groaned. Great, another mecha otaku. Damn my luck, two in the same terrorist cell. Yes, a nightmare. Seems like one of the gangs actually was stealing Britannian surplus. I realized my arm was still up, and lamely let it fall to my side. I was just asking Tamaki if there was a place he knew about where we could store it. Got any ideas, Callan? The half-Britannian hummed for a moment, turning the idea over in her head, before letting out an exasperated growl and shaking her head. Dad's got a boat shed down in the holiday colony on Enoshima, but there's no way we can get this thing all the way there without someone seeing it. That's more or less what I'd figured myself. I looked over at Tamaki, who was still staring at the Glasgow with a heartbroken expression, and felt a stirring of sympathy. He didn't need to be here for the next part. Plus, we're running out of time. Tamaki, I began, speaking kindly and gently as if to a child, why don't you go help Units 2 and 3 grab everything of value that we can, okay? Callan and I will handle this. But the chicks would really dig me if I was a nightmare pilot. Tamaki whined, although he obligingly turned and started heading back up the platform, cursing as he nearly slipped on a pool of mingled blood and shit as he left. I rolled my eyes and smiled. It's good for morale to have jokers in the unit, I supposed. I should talk to him about time and place, though. He's good at slapstick, but this isn't really the place for it. As he left, I turned back to Callan and let the levity drop from my face and voice. Back to work, huh? Guess the team leader can't slack off on projects. We're gonna need to disable this thing beyond all repair before we leave. If the gangs start rocketing around in nightmares, no telling what the Britannians will do to re-establish their monopoly on the technology. Callan took the sudden change in topic in stride, and just nodded along. I'm not sure how we're going to do that, she admitted, as she pulled a grenade out of her pack, but I bet a few of these in the cockpit will handle it. A girl after Koenig's heart. Absolutely. One wedged right above the energy cartridge too. But how to secure and remotely detonate them? Stay here, I'll be right back. Fortunately, it turned out that Ogi still had the leftover bundle of twine from last night tucked away in his backpack. As he dug it out, he let me know that all the Britannian currency, drugs, and ammunition that had survived the blast intact was more or less all packed up, and Ino had taken it upon herself to task the idle members of Units 2 and 3, and Tamaki, with policing up all the cell phones from the various gangsters on the off chance that any were usable and unlocked. I thanked him for the update and told him to pass the word to Nato to start the withdrawal up the east stairway. I'll see you back at the hideout. I finished as I pinned the fraudulent notice from the purists claiming responsibility for the attack to the broken half of a table using a knife requisitioned from a nearby torso. Remember to ditch the costume before you get too far. No need to create a string of witnesses across Shinjuku. Yeah, we know. We're not old enough to get dementia, Tanya. Figures that Ogi the sadist would have no problem cracking jokes at a time like this. As the rest of the cell streamed past us and up the rubble-choked staircase, Callan and I carefully wedged the 4 grenades we had between ourselves into the central joints of the Glasgow and into the cockpit. Before we put the grenades in place, we tied a length of twine to the pins, and tied those lengths of twine to a second, much longer piece. Ideally, we could get to the stairs, pull the string from there, and run as far up behind them as possible before the explosion, avoiding the embarrassing possibility of taking the only injuries sustained on this mission from our own shrapnel. I doubted that fragmentation grenades would be adequate to permanently incapacitate a nightmare, but I hoped that the Sakuradite core powering the vehicle's Yggdrasil drive and the Sakuradite in the energy cartridge would be detonated by the grenade's detonations. And so, 2 minutes past my 5-minute deadline, I pulled the sting and sprinted up the stairway, heavy backpack thumping at my ground as I leapt over the chunks of cement and the crooked shafts of rebar that seemed to reach out to trip me, Callan hot on my heels. Behind me, I heard the sound of something falling and cursed. One of the grenades got pulled out of the nightmare. Too late now. I wasn't heading back to see if the other 3 pins had come free or not. As it turned out, at least one had clearly detonated, and equally clearly it was the one wedged between the pilot block and the energy cartridge. The initial crackling explosion of the grenade was soon followed by a deeper bellow, prompting me to dump all my reserved energy into my enhancement suite, relying on my supercharged reflexes to dive through gaps in the rubble and to leap over the many impediments. Callan somehow kept up, and I drove the bitter envy from my mind as the athletic noble easily kept up with me. Damn the Kozukis and their superior breeding. Truly, there was something to be said for hybrid vigor. Pity I didn't seem to have any of it. By the time we hurtled out into the cold outside air, it was clear that the explosion of the nightmare's Sakuradite, coupled with the pipe bombs, had been the final straw. As we ran down the street, away from the visibly teetering skeleton of an office building that stood atop the old Shinjuku Gyomei station, I could only be thankful that no civilians seemed to be out and about. Presumably the 2 bloody corpses lying out on the street, coupled with the sounds of gunshots and explosions, had been enough of a hint that the area was dangerous. Admittedly, I hadn't expected the dangers of the area to include the final collapse of one of Shinjuku's many cadaverous buildings, but it was hardly the first building I'd brought crumbling to the ground. I'm sure, given time, the other inhabitants of Shinjuku would grow equally accustomed to the sight. 2 blocks away from the ruins of Shinjuku Gyomei Station, I ducked into an alleyway, Callan hot on my heels. Resisting the urge to surrender to my aching limbs and collapse against the wall, I quickly started stripping away my disguise. The last thing I wanted was for any survivors to hear reports of people in blood-stained medical scrubs heading to a certain basement. The gloves came off in 2 efficient tugs, and were balled up with the goggles and the mask inside the knit cap a moment later. Bending down, I tucked the bundle of fabric into a pile of bricks fallen from a nearby building and swiftly pulled my scrub top off over my head, cramming it into the rubble pile after the hat. Turning to check on my comrade, I saw Callan doing much the same thing as I had, quickly stripping her disguise off. In the alley, dingy even in the faint light of the joyless November sun, her incredibly vivid hair was an eye-catching explosion of red as she shook it free from her cap. As Callan pulled the scrub top off, leaning back to try and wiggle a shoulder free of the medical garment, I saw a flash of skin as the vest she wore underneath tried to follow the disposable layer and exposed her belly. For some reason, I didn't immediately turn away. The adrenaline spike of going into danger had already begun to fade, and after days of planning and the intensity of the last 15 minutes, my mind felt dull and heavy. My eyes locked on Callan's smooth skin, and while I dimly knew I should look away, I remained transfixed. I knew that it would be awkward if she turned around and saw me blankly staring at her, but that concern felt unimportant compared to the exhaustion that seemed to swallow me up. I suddenly realized I was swaying on my feet, and about to fall over. The tilting sensation grounded me back in the present, and I realized I'd spent at least a few seconds blankly staring at Callan's back. Immediately, I spun around and vigorously shook my head. This is no time to be zoning out. You're in enemy territory. The mission's not over yet. Remembering the possibility that irate gangsters might already be out hunting for whoever attacked the market, I kept my eyes fixed on the entrance to the alley, checking to make sure nobody had seen us dart inside and followed us. Unfortunately, the street outside appeared entirely deserted, presumably as the wise had fled the sound of nearby explosions and the foolish had gone to the station to take a look, so I had nothing to focus on to distract myself from the grunting noises Callan made as she fought to free herself from her shirt. If I wasn't so hungry and tired, I'm sure a few joking remarks would have leapt to mind about how Callan could effortlessly gun down a man but couldn't change her clothes without the help of a maid, but all I could think of at the moment was how badly I wanted a cup of the rare, watery coffee I sometimes allowed myself. Besides, I doubted that Callan would appreciate attempts at levity while we were out on a mission, especially not about the man she'd shot minutes before. Her second kill, now that I think about it. The first with a gun. Wonder how it felt, compared to the knife? Callan soon managed to shuck off the scrubs, and after taking a moment to straighten her clothes out, joined me in the mouth of the alley. Free of our disguises, we took the scenic route back to the hideout, going far out of our way and taking a circuitous route through the tangled streets and alleys of Shinjuku. I did my best to move the same way I had during my long years of searching out day labor for my daily bowl of watery soup, head down, shoulders slumped, steps small and shuffling. Ogi's hoodie, once again stained with blood and cement dust, was bulky enough to hide in and the hood deep enough to completely hide my unfortunately distinctive hair. Callan, by contrast, made no effort to conceal her Britannian heritage, instead focusing on concealing her reason for being in Shinjuku Ghetto on the day of a major terrorist attack. Putting her cell phone to her ear, she immediately began to babble excitedly into the phone as we headed west, away from both the ruins of Shinjuku Gyomei Station and from the hideout. Even as she chatted with an imaginary conversation partner, Callan still managed an impressive degree of mobility, somehow sliding in, out, and around the increasingly dense pedestrians, forcing me to speed up to keep pace with her longer strides. When she'd first begun walking down the road as we'd left the alley, phone glued to her ear and a stream of almost stereotypical teenage babble filling the air, I'd nearly pulled Callan right back into the shadows to give her a quick lesson on how to not draw every eye in the ghetto, but now I was thankful I had mastered that impulse. Nobody would link the young woman prancing through the ghetto in short shorts and leg warmers to a terrorist attack. While people certainly saw her, nobody particularly cared about a Britannian teenager on a thrill trip to the 11 ghetto, especially not when the rising plume of dust in the distance and the already spreading rumors let everybody know something big was happening nearby. A few people frowned at her apparent insensitivity when Callan commented on the smell of the ghetto or how lucky she'd been to be in Shinjuku when something interesting happened, but aside from muttering about damned Brits, nobody seemed particularly interested in what she was doing or where she was going. I was right to trust her as an intelligence agent, if her tradecraft has developed so rapidly. It was an impressive performance, so much so that I started to doubt my decision to go as low profile as possible. While everybody saw Callan, nobody was suspicious of her, irritated, yes, scornful, maybe, but suspicious, no. On the other hand, with my features hidden by the oversized hoodie and the way I instinctively shied away from touching anybody else while still keeping as close to Callan as possible, I suddenly realized that I probably looked exactly like a fugitive desperate to escape the scene of a crime undetected. I thought of myself as being fairly decent at reconnaissance, my eye for terrain details sharpened by my time as first an artillery spotter and then as the head of an independent command of aerial majors, but I couldn't pretend to be similarly experienced with human intelligence. I had been, after all, a combat asset, not a spook. There were only so many problems you could solve via signaling, after all, and a savage beating wasn't the end-all, be-all when it came to interrogation. As a result of my magical abilities and talents as a soldier, I'd never been trained for this sort of subterfuge in my past life. The extent of infiltration planning had been a brief seminar on planning and executing ambushes, the lessons of which had already paid off in this third life, when I'd gotten the drop on those unlucky gangsters in the truck. Fortunately, I now had comrades who understood human intelligence, and who were clearly cold-blooded enough to push every advantage at their disposal to advance the mission. I looked admiringly at Callan as she made her way down yet another Shinjuku street, seeming to dodge around elderly pedestrians, street vendors, and the heaps of stinking garbage without noticing anything around her, absorbed in her noisy, faked conversation. What audacity, to hide in plain sight and make not the slightest effort to conceal your presence. She'd clearly grown from her previous encounter with violence. Last time she'd barely walked a block before bursting into unconcealed anger and pain, and now it was as if nothing she'd seen in the subway station had touched her. Or maybe her mask has just gotten better. Eventually, the crowds thinned out, and we finally made it back to our basement hideout. The sun had begun to set as we came down the stairs, which were thankfully free of any signs of a struggle, much less a force of irate gangsters waiting for us in our little hole in the ground sanctuary with murder on their minds. Apparently, the Kozuki organization had gotten away undetected, at least for today. Safe for today, sure. How long do you think that's going to last? With a vigorous shake of the head, I muted that particular internal voice. I couldn't even truly say we were safe for the day yet, not until I'd checked in and made sure that all the other scattered guerrillas had all made it back safely. I'm sure they did, I told myself as I followed Callan down the last flight of stairs, The sound of the secret generator throbbing through the uninsulated wall of the sub-basement. They probably didn't even wait for us to start celebrating their victory. As it turned out, we had been the last to return, but contrary to my expectations, we did not walk in on a party in full swing. Instead, as Callan opened the door to the hideout and stepped inside, I caught a brief glance of a room full of anxious, silent people sitting on the couches or pacing around the firing range before everybody noticed us and chaos descended. Callan. Naoto practically hurled himself to his feet and almost tackled his sister in a hug, rushing from the couch to the doorway in a red and brown blur. Callan mumbled a greeting into his jacketed shoulder as she wrapped her arms around him, returning the hug even as she took a step back to compensate for his momentum, nearly stepping on my foot. I could hear what sounded like her cursing at him through the leather of his coat, probably some sort of endearing sibling spat about how she wasn't a kid and he was embarrassing her, but I noticed that she made no effort to let go of her big brother, and indeed clung onto him just as hard as he did her. Dodging Callan's foot, I tried to take a step around the siblings into the room, intending to give them some space. I was sure that Naoto was probably still at least somewhat upset with me for getting Callan involved in the first place, and I'm sure stewing in his own juices for a few hours as we'd taken a pedestrian tour of Shinjuku probably hadn't done anything to soothe his aristocratic temper. Furthermore, now that the adrenaline of the situation had gone down, I was sure he'd be upset that I'd taken his baby sister to a mass casualty incident. I suddenly remembered seeing Callan stumbling to a halt and shaking in her boots, eyes wide and pupils dilated in the dark subway station, and winced. Even if Naoto wasn't upset with me about instigating that particular traumatic episode, my lack of sympathy in the immediate aftermath would guarantee his anger. I'd hoped that, between his logical intelligence and leadership experience, he'd realize that I was just trying to keep things moving and would understand why I'd been so callous, but considering how fervently he was hugging Callan, it was clear that Big Brother Naoto was in charge at the moment, not Revolutionary Leader Naoto, which made it all the more surprising when, as I stepped around the siblings, Naoto abruptly released Callan and grabbed me, pulling me close. For an instant, I tried to resist the pull, impulses to flee from the sudden onslaught or launch an attack warring within my exhausted mind, but between the surprise and the fatigue I was too tired and surprised to fight back. The moment passed, and I realized that I wasn't under attack. Instead, for the second time, Naoto was hugging me. I grimaced, discomforted by both the public display of emotion, affection. Either way, it made me embarrassed to be casually manhandled in front of everybody, and the unaccountable warmth inside me at the feeling of being held tight to another person who wasn't trying to hurt me did nothing to soothe my mounting embarrassment at this latest humiliation. Callan smiled happily down at us until she met my eyes, saw my displeased expression, and her smile curved wickedly before she burst out laughing, the treacherous wench. Before I could extract myself from the hug to take revenge on my traitor of a subordinate, and didn't that word seem just a bit forced, Naoto loosened his grip, backing off a step and making eye contact. His blue eyes, a slightly darker shade than his sister's, were as intense as they were watery, and I felt the same treacherous acceleration of my heart I'd experienced a few hours earlier at the sight of his sister's smooth skin. His ancestors surely must have engaged in some form of eugenics program. It's the only reasonable explanation. Genetic inheritance surely wouldn't be so cruel as to randomly give a single already wealthy and powerful family beauty, strength, and intelligence on top of social standing and financial power, would it? Nature might not, but like all things Britannian and noble, the Kozuki siblings were clearly the products of unfair competition. Definitely not interesting for anything beyond their connections and abilities, not at all. Just part of my path to a cushy job administering their father's domain. That's all. Damn those blue eyes. This was ridiculous. He was showing just a slight amount of affection to me, and I was obsessing over his eyes. Is this some sort of insidious Britannian love bombing? Am I being influenced? No, that's ridiculous. Thank you, Tanya, for everything you've done. I felt myself sway slightly, suddenly pulled out of my thoughts by Naoto's thankful babble, hating how my paranoid, interaction-starved mind and weak knees betrayed me. That, or the cost of tapping my energy reserves during the rush out of the station, was finally making itself known, and I was about to pass out from exhaustion and hunger. Perhaps that explains why I can't stay focused. I'm dead on my feet. I really needed to ask Callan to get me more fat and protein-heavy food if I intended to keep using my limited magic, especially if it left me this mentally fatigued whenever I pushed a bit too far, and Naoto was still talking. I probably didn't miss much. I wonder if he's got any snacks. Your plan was everything I could have ever hoped for and more. And thank you, for keeping Callan safe. You were true to your word. The goddess Amaterasu herself couldn't have done a better job smiting those monsters. Naoto chuckled at his joke, before clapping me on the shoulder, rising back to his full height, and leading his sister over to a table creaking under the weight of a heavy pot full of what looked like a thick stew, perched precariously on an ancient cooking stove. As soon as I saw the pot, which Suikairo was carefully stirring, a sudden awareness of the heady smell of cooked food burst upon me, and I felt my mouth flood with saliva as my nose suddenly registered the sense of grease, salt, and broth. I was sure the visibly greasy stew swirling in the pot would have turned my stomach in my past life, when I'd grown passionately sick of endless worst, but I was so hungry that I'd even be willing to pull a vicious old stunt and eat a plate of cabarot. Before I could take 2 steps to follow the Kozukis and snag a bowl for myself, another hand landed on my shoulder. Wearily, irrationally fearing that taking my eyes off the soup would guarantee I'd never get fed, I looked up at Ogi. He seemed about to say something weighty, judging by his expression, something that he had to get off his chest, but something he saw made him take pity on me. Instead of the lecture I was certain the sadistic former teacher would deploy to devastating effect, he simply smiled and patted me on the shoulder. Go on and get something to eat, we can talk later. Almost before his hand had lifted away, I capitalized on my advantage and surged away from the second in command, blazing a line straight towards the soup. Nagata, sitting beside Naoto on the couch, pressed a bowl into my hands as I passed, and Sushiero filled it with a generous ladle. Cradling my bowl like the precious thing it was and slowing only to grab a spoon from a heap of loose cutlery at the end of the table, I sat down on the other couch between Tamaki and Chihiro, who were both chasing after intoxication as quickly as they could drink. Tamaki had a bottle of some sort of homemade rocket in his hand, while Chihiro had a water glass a third full of some evil-smelling clear spirit. As soon as I sat down, Chihiro lifted the glass over my head and with a loud kompai, Tamaki filled it from his bottle. I didn't care, I was in a slice of culinary heaven. The broth was almost painfully salty, the few scraps of meat were either gristly or greasy, and the vegetables had been overboiled almost to the point of dissolution and well past the point of tastelessness, but the fine spice of hunger made it a meal fit for the Kaiser in his palace, free from any rationing or shortage. As I inhaled my soup, I took the opportunity to look around at the rest of the Kozuki cell, covertly observing my comrades over the rim of the rapidly emptying bowl. On first glance, all appeared to be well. Sushiro and Ogi stood by the door, bowls in hand and talking about something I couldn't quite make out, presumably the good old days as old men are wont to do. Ino sat over at the firing range's loading table, going through one of the packs deposited in a heap by her feet, clearly taking the initiative and starting an inventory of what loot we'd managed to get away with, a bowl of cooling stew near her hand. Nagato and Naoto were swapping jokes back and forth, laughing at each other, Callan laughing along from her seat between them, across the table from me. Chihiro and Tamaki continued to drink, Tamaki loudly bragging about something mostly indecipherable and Chihiro nodding along, every so often extending her glass towards him in a silent request for a refill of the pungent homemade liquor. While I was happy to see my comrades enjoying a well-earned moment of relaxation, the longer I looked at them the more superficial all the celebration seemed. Tamaki might be a drunk, but I'd never seen him pound away at a bottle of hard liquor with the same aggressive pace he was setting beside me. Chihiro, in my experience, was typically a hair's breadth from an explosion of rage at the best of time, periodically flying off the handle at seemingly minor setbacks during training. Her uncommunicative, subdued state seemed wildly out of character, as did the amount of liquor she was downing. Ino was always a hard worker, but she usually socialized with the rest of the cell when we all happened to be at the hideout at the same time. Burying herself in work was something she typically did while alone, or when it was only the two of us working on keeping the Benevolent Association's books straight. Nagata and the Kozukis might be laughing and joking, but the laughter from all three sounded hollow, and Callan in particular looked worryingly bleak, chuckling half-heartedly while staring into the bowl of congealing stew sitting on the table in front of her. While I couldn't hear what Ogi and Sushiro were saying over Tamaki, I could see how Ogi's eyes darted from person to person, keeping tabs on his class and making sure nobody had wandered off. In short, the party was a sham and nobody was happy to be here. Completely understandable, considering what we'd all seen just hours before. My stomach twisted, and I cursed under my breath. I known I would pay for wolfing down that disgusting meal so quickly, but I hadn't expected indigestion so soon. Setting the horrible feeling in my empty bowl aside, I tried to think of what I should do to address this new problem. My experience managing human resources in both my previous lives told me that letting my organization stew would likely decrease both individual and organizational efficiency, and could severely impact intra-organizational relationships, particularly with myself as the instigator of the whole event. Even beyond the concern that I might become the whipping girl for any misplaced anger or stress, letting fresh employees or soldiers go without support after major milestones was an excellent way to impact their ability to develop and grow from their experience. If I didn't intervene somehow, and just let the cell self-medicate their problems away, didn't that make me a negligent manager? At the same time, I had no qualms admitting that I was not, in fact, a qualified therapist, and I doubted that my experience performing performance reviews and career advancement meetings would carry over to dealing with this kind of issue. It certainly hadn't the last time around. Now that I looked back on my second life, I'd periodically invested my efforts in improving the abilities of my subordinates, both before and after the formation of the 203rd, but that had mostly been performative in nature and technical in scope. I might have improved the skills of the soldiers I'd worked with, but I had never thought it necessary to give any psychological support to my subordinates. I had maintained the distance of command, concerned that any laxness or casual interactions would undermine my authority, always a concern when one is 3 heads shorter and 100 pounds lighter than everybody around them. The only time I had ever so much as tried to help my subordinates with their qualms regarding the war and what we were doing had been coercing Grants into engaging with the Francois partisans during the Arene operation. That whole operation, including my advice to Lieutenant Grants, now felt bitterly ironic, now that I myself was a partisan conducting terrorist acts. I remembered the callous way I had stood by and recorded the summary executions of captured Germanians by the partisans, and the equally callous way I'd rained fire down on suspected partisan positions, uncaring of potential civilian deaths. I hadn't been wrong when I'd told Grants that those who survive always come back for vengeance, and the Britannians would certainly learn the truth of those words from long ago and far away too. At the same time, I could have handled that whole situation better, both the tactical problem of Arene and the managerial problem of Lieutenant Grants. Grants clearly needed a reach out, a reassurance, something constructive to build his loyalty and faith in the righteousness of our cause, and I'd bungled the situation and resorted to threats instead. It was fortunate that the whole experience hadn't burnt Grants out entirely, and that he'd continued to serve as part of the 203rd. That had been far from my first managerial error when it came to my first independent command. With the benefit of hindsight and free from the mind-altering influence of the Type 95, I could admit to myself that I had gone overboard in both my initial training of the 203rd. The only saving grace had been that my training hadn't actually killed anybody, and that my pool of recruits had been selected from the creme of the Imperial Army's Mage Corps, and thus already had some training and superhuman toughness. Even with those advantages, if I didn't have the military hierarchy and the desperation of the war to hide behind, I likely would have been court-martialed for my abusive conduct. And now, stripped of those advantages, I found myself once more outside of my core competencies for the second time in a day. Earlier today, Callan had proven her grasp of human intelligence and infiltration had, in some ways, far exceeded my own. In a moment I had neither prompted nor planned for, she had immediately understood the best way to guarantee her safe passage back to the hideout unconnected to the attack we had perpetrated minutes before. I had not understood what Callan had been aiming for until I examined her actions and the responses they prompted minutes later. In fact, I had nearly stopped her and forced her to do things my way, which ultimately might have led the vengeful survivors of the Kokirikai straight to our front door. Although, perhaps that was the lesson I should have learned. I might be somewhat skilled, especially when it came to combat, but I wasn't the only member of the organization who brought specialized experience to the table. I was a member of a team now, not a lone child fending for herself on the streets, and I should act accordingly. Trying to take all responsibility on myself was a sure way to crash and burn, or at the very least make everybody resent me more than they already do, the murderous little half-bred whorechild. Yes, delegation was important. Someone needed to talk to the members of the cell, to get their grievances aired so they could be addressed, before the trauma and resulting dissatisfaction tore us apart or undermined my comrades' mental health. And that someone wasn't going to be me, because I'd probably definitely screw it up just as much as I had when I tried to talk to Lieutenant Grants. I found myself looking at Ogi, still deep in conversation with Suichiro. As the second in command of the Kozuki cell, not to mention as a former teacher, he definitely had the skills necessary to coax honest answers from our fellow terrorists about what they were feeling in the wake of our first major operation. His role as an officer was a double-edged sword, since while he had the power to take immediate action on any lessons learned or suggestions for improvement, that same authority might bias answers towards the party line and assurances that everybody was feeling fine, especially considering what I remembered from my first life. Complaining to superior was frowned upon in most cases, but especially if your complaints touched on about personal problems or concerns about mental stability. Considering the impact the conquest had on the traditional forms of Japanese life, that might not be as big of a concern now, but there was still the hint of sadism I'd noticed in Ogi before to worry about. If I asked him to start probing into our comrades, would he take advantage of them and use whatever he discovered to needle them, gratifying his sick impulses? Would he take advantage of me, blackmailing me with the weakness I'd revealed, the implied mistrust of my fellow cell members? If Ogi or Naoto ever decided that I was threatening their status as the unquestioned leaders of the cell, revealing that I'd wanted my comrades interrogated would lead everybody to turn on me, and I'd be found in an alley somewhere in Shinjuku with my tongue cut out and my eyes gouged. I took another bite of soup, and closed my eyes. I was letting my fear get to me. Ogi wasn't going to betray me, and he wasn't going to abuse our fellows. No matter what his personal predilections were, the man was a professional, loyal to both Naoto and the cause. It was wrong to judge him for enjoying the infliction of pain. Such a trait could be useful in a soldier, doubly so in an irregular fighter. He had never been anything less than personally kind to me, and I doubted that Kallen, Tamaki, Nagata, or Ino would simply sit by and let Naoto and Ogi administer the traditional punishment for snitches, if push came to shove. I prided myself on my logic, on thinking things through clearly, and on utilizing resources to their fullest potential. I hadn't let fear immobilize me when Naoto had used Tamaki to test my abilities and loyalty to the cause, and I wouldn't let fear stop me from doing what I had to do to make sure everybody in this room stayed as healthy as could be, mentally and physically. We had a long road ahead of us, and I'd need everybody's help to finally get my rear into an executive-level cushioned office seat. Well, no time like the present. Plus, I was out of soup, and Tamaki and Chihiro were only getting louder with each swig. With a grunt of effort, I forced myself to my feet and dropped my empty bowl onto the table next to the still half-full pot. The thick, rich scent of simmering broth was intoxicating, and I nearly halted in my tracks to serve myself seconds, but forced myself to keep moving. There would hopefully be time for more soup later, and if not, I'd had enough to tamp down the hunger pangs to a manageable level. I hoped that bowl would be enough to restore my mind to its typical efficiency at the very least. Ogi apparently saw me coming, as he clapped Suichiro on the shoulder and came over to meet me by the table. Feeling a bit better now, Tanya? You can have more if you'd like. The man's smile was kind, and I nearly succumbed to temptation once again, but I persevered. The attack on the market had been my first mission as a strategist and junior officer of the organization. I couldn't rest until my mission was complete, including dealing with the aftermath and accounting for our gains and losses. Which reminded me that after I talked with Ogi about meeting with the other members of the cell individually, I needed to meet up with Ino to see if we'd managed to at least break even on our mission. Apparently, my schedule wouldn't allow me back for seconds. Maybe I'll see if I can raid Ogi's snack stash again later. If he didn't move it after Kallen broke in the last time. Thank you, but I'm alright for now. For some reason, Ogi didn't look pleased at my professional response, his smile seeming to shrink by a few teeth. Perhaps the cool response was puncturing the party atmosphere? It would be unfortunate to be seen as aloof, but more so to be seen as unreliable, so I soldiered on. Can I speak to you privately, for a moment? I have something I need your help with. Ogi's eyes widened slightly, but his only outward response was an easy nod. That's fine with me, Tanya. I actually wanted to talk with you about something myself. He jerked his head towards the door of the hideout, and continued, want to go up and get some fresh air? It's getting a bit too loud in here for me. I nodded, even as I tried to puzzle out what it was he wanted to talk about. Now that I thought about it, Ogi had tried to take me aside before I'd eaten, practically as soon as I'd returned from the mission trailing behind Callan. Presumably, whatever it was the second in command had to share was time-sensitive, and I cursed my short-sightedness that I had opted to satisfy my hunger before listening to whatever it was he wanted to say. He had told me it could wait until after I'd eaten though, presumably because he'd realized that I wouldn't be able to think straight with the tantalizing scent of dinner in my nose. Sadist or not, I've worked under far worse bosses before. I really should be more thankful to Naoto and Ogi for the amount of trust and support they had extended to me, as well as the opportunity to prove myself worthy to the game Lord Stadtfeld was playing with us all. Outside in the ruins of the old tenement, the day's small heat was already a thing of the past, and the wind coming off Tokyo Bay kilometers away cut effortlessly through my hoodie. Shivering, I took shelter behind a wall that blocked the worst of the wind chill and hoped this conversation wouldn't take too long. Already, the warmth and food of the sub-basement seemed like a dream in the brutally cold November night. Thankfully, Ogi opted to stand between me and the shattered window, letting the wet breeze inside, further blocking the wind, and didn't waste any time. You did a really good job, Tanya, getting everything planned out and working. It was impressive, seeing you plan out the attack in such detail, and then getting all the parts together. Solid work. I don't think Naoto or I could do something like that. Well, at least I don't feel cold anymore. It was nice having management that could appreciate my work, and was willing to offer positive feedback as appropriate. That said, oh shit, what did I do wrong? True to his sadistic nature, Ogi left me on a hook for what felt like a small eternity, the seconds-long gap slowly stretching out to a minute before he continued. That said, I'm not comfortable with killing injured people. I know, there were lots of good reasons that you'd be happy to share. I hadn't realized my mouth was already open, ready to spout justifications and explanations until Ogi gestured for me to stay quiet. Reluctantly, I closed my mouth, feeling fit to burst like an overpressurized pipe. Did he think that I liked it? I didn't. I hated it. But what was I supposed to do? Let them live and tell everybody what we look like? Even in costume, if they picked out enough details, everybody would be in danger. And the ones down in the station weren't going to live. Should I have just let them suffer, Ogi? The last thought clotted the panicked babble into a sensation of solid mass in the back of my throat. He said he just didn't feel comfortable killing the injured, which made sense given his personality. A corpse, after all, cannot scream. I'm not asking you to justify anything. I don't have the right to do so. Ogi had continued to talk after a brief pause, and I forced my attention back to what he was saying, doing my best to ignore the wet gurgles that the disemboweled man down in the station had made until I had silenced him. Ultimately, even though he still lived, he hadn't screamed either. Naoto and I agreed to your plan, and helped you out. We even helped you plant the bombs ourselves. It's just that. Well, it made me feel like a Britannian, I guess. They couldn't fight back, and we killed them. I guess that's just part of being a terrorist, though. Silently, I agreed with him. This wasn't going to be a clean war, and lots of people, including civilians, were going to die. The way he phrased that concern still felt like a gut punch though, even if I'm sure he hadn't intended it to be. I remembered watching a Britannian officer pick his way through the pile of corpses strewn at the foot of a wall, carefully prodding each body and shooting any that groaned in the head with his pistol. He had been just as externally calm and collected as I had been, moving down the blood-slick platform. I suddenly felt nauseated and shamed by the praise Ogi had given me just seconds before. I didn't regret what I had made possible, but the idea that I had acted like a Britannian, that the plans inspired by my past lives made being a Britannian in mind a possibility, a state of mind that came naturally to me and to my planning process. It was shameful. Once again, I remembered being on the side with dominance of arms and technology, and felt ashamed of my actions. Killing the Dacian army and taking only the commander alive had been effortless. Knocking their country out of the war had been as easily achieved as the Britannian conquest of my youth, even easier, since we didn't even suffer a minor defeat like the Britannians had at Tsukushima. Eterine. While I hadn't had the authority to attack the city, I had been the one to draw up the plan unbinding the army's hands, and I had used my tactical authority to ensure that plan was carried out as close to perfection as could be. Perhaps being X had been crueler than I thought, when he'd reincarnated me for the second time. I thought the hair, eyes, and face, the same as my second life, had just been his attempt at a joke. When I'd learned about the circumstances of my new life, I had thought it was a simple way to increase the difficulty of my new life, a cursed gift by a wannabe deity. Now, I wondered if his decision to encumber me with Britannian heritage had been a damning indictment of my moral character in his eyes. True, God or not, being X was in no way my moral superior, but I couldn't help but think his decision to make my sire in this life a member of the greatest race of callous murderers around was a hint about how the alleged deity saw me. If so, I couldn't honestly say that he was entirely wrong. My works proved him at least partially right. I'm sorry, I probably shouldn't have put that on you. I could still hear Ogi talking, but he felt some distance away, as I pondered the mysterious ways in which being X worked. I'm sure you're beating yourself up now, but you really shouldn't. I was trying to say that I'm sure other members of our group are going to feel the same way, so I will talk to them to make sure they understand that Naoto and I fully backed your plan, and they should come to us if they have concerns. Tanya? Tanya? I snapped back into the present as Ogi gently shook me, forcing my mind away from contemplating that evil unknowable bastard and trying to rewind what Ogi had been saying as I spaced out. He was crouched low now, eyes level with my own, and he looked quite concerned. I tried to force a smile, to try and show that I was aware and listening, so he didn't need to look at me like I'm some weak girl who can't hack it. I'm not. I'm strong. I'm strong. I'm not weak, I'm not broken, so please don't look at me with pity. I was injured. Thank you, Ogi. I forced the words out, and to my relief they came out smoothly, my voice cool and unwavering, untouched by my internal whining. I actually wanted to ask you to talk to the other members of the cell. I realize that most of them haven't seen anything like that before, and I don't think I'd be able to. I don't think most of our comrades would be willing to truthfully tell me what they think. Now that I was acting again, moving forward on an issue I had identified, I felt a bit more in control. I just need to keep moving forwards, I realized. Every time I look back I let myself get distracted, so I just need to stay active, not reactive. If possible, I would like for you to meet with each of them individually, to give them an opportunity to freely express their views and concerns. The sooner the better. If we let them bottle it up for too long, their mental stability might be undermined, reducing their efficacy. The same goes for you, Tanya. His immediate response was like a slap across my face, and if Ogi hadn't had his hand on my shoulder I might have actually rocked back. Does he see me as mentally unstable? No. No. I don't have anywhere to go. I can't leave the group. I don't want to be alone again. Please, no. I'm good. I realized I'd started to hyperventilate, and fought to get my breath under control again. Passing out would do nothing to improve Ogi's apparently low opinion of me, and it would guarantee I'd never have a hand in planning anything again, endangering my planned path to a safe management position far from the front lines. Ogi sighed, and patted me on the head with his other hand. I focused on the sensation of the hand on my shoulder and the hand on my head, drawing stability from the feeling of the pressure and hating myself for the weakness I was clearly showing to my superior. You're acting like an upset child, having a tantrum and needing her daddy to pamper her to calm her down. I cringed at the mental image and tried to force it away. Ogi wasn't my father, he was my boss. I didn't have a father. I didn't have a mother. I just had a job, a cause, and co-workers. That's all. Feeling good from human touch may be instinctual, but it was also a weakness. This was a dangerous life, and it was impossible to know who being X or the Britannians might tear from me next. I couldn't let myself get attached to Ogi, to Naoto, or even to Callan. I hadn't been hurt when my mother had died because I hadn't let myself get attached to her. One of the few times you've shown wisdom so far. After a minute or three, once my breathing calmed, I stepped back, and Ogi let me go, moving his hands away and standing up again. Even though I had resented being comforted, I still felt shockingly cold once I was alone out of his reach again. You might have a point, but I request you speak with the others first. I've seen something like this before, as best I know, none of them have. It will be harder on them, since it's their first time, so. Ogi frowned slightly, but nodded, and started moving back towards the hidden staircase. All right, Tanya, I'll talk to them. You're right, everybody should have an opportunity to talk about the station in private with someone. But, he turned back around and looked squarely at me with the mien of a suddenly stern teacher gazing at a disappointing student trying to explain why her homework was missing for the 5th time in a row. You and I are going to have a talk too. You're not getting out of it this time. You were right, people need a chance to talk, and that includes you, that includes me, and that includes Naoto. Just, please, trust us. You're one of us, so let me help you. As he made the last point, Ogi's voice had grown increasingly intense. Seeming to notice this, he paused and took a deep breath, before saying, we're not going to think less of you because you need to talk, okay? So don't just beat yourself up. And with that, he was gone, descending back down the stairs. And with that, I was alone again in the cold of nighttime Shinjuku, contemplating what I should do next. Over the next several days, I buried myself in managing the Rising Sun Benevolent Association. Thankfully, at least one of the objectives I'd had in mind when planning the attack on the gang market had been accomplished. Not only had the Kozuki organization managed to recoup the costs of the operation, we had managed to turn a sizable profit. Between the clean and only moderately blood-stained cash the cell's members had managed to grab, the various narcotics scavenged from both a few of the stalls and fallen gangsters' personal effects, and the jewelry looted from those same dead gangsters, Ino estimated that we were far enough in the black to keep the Benevolent Association running for quite some time. Admittedly, the net profit of the mission was reduced by the need to keep greasing the palms of the checkpoint guards, and would further be reduced by the costs associated with the creative accounting we'd need to do to explain where the association was getting its funding from come tax time, but such was the cost of doing business. While the need to contribute to societal corruption was galling, it was easy to rationalize. Without participating in Britannian graft, it would be impossible to feed and clothe the people of the ghetto, and all of our efforts would be for naught. Of course, the Rising Sun would hardly be seeing all the money we'd earned from our strike against the Shinjuku underworld. A significant piece of our income would be going to Mr. Asahara in exchange for more of his devices. Which brought me to the other objective I'd had in mind for my plan. I'd wanted to blood my new organization in a safe, morally unambiguous manner that would guarantee that everybody would kill at least once. Ideally, this would bind everybody together, increasing organizational loyalty through the shared experience of combat, and would also ensure that everybody was truly committed to the goal of improving the lot of our people, through violence if necessary. Whether or not I'd managed to fulfill this objective was still ambiguous, to say the least. On the good side, we hadn't lost anybody. Thanks to my careful planning and our cooperative preparation, every member of the Kozuki cell had returned alive and physically unharmed, while our enemies had suffered virtually total losses. None of the cell's members had lost their nerve when push came to shove, and I was fairly sure that everybody had killed at least once during the cleanup down in the station. There certainly hadn't been any shortage of targets. Thus far, nobody had confronted me about the plan, and as far as I knew nobody had challenged Ogi or Naoto in regards to their support and agreement either. The morally unambiguous aspect, however, was rapidly turning into a botched mistake in my eyes. The aftermath of the shrapnel bombs had been traumatic, and the requirement that the enemy injured had to be executed had deepened the trauma. I had overestimated both the callousness and emotional capacities of myself and my team. I'd expected shock, of course, but I had hoped that between my emphasis on the gang's nature as Britannian collaborators and Naoto's pep talk assuring everybody that our cause was righteous, the initial shock would be the worst of it. Nobody had frozen during the brief period of active combat, and the cell was only briefly stunned by what they saw as they entered the station, but what they had seen and done were proving harder to cope with in the aftermath. I could sympathize. Looking back, I hadn't even considered how I would feel after the operation, and if I had, I likely would have just shrugged it off and considered it unlikely that I would be overly concerned. After all, I am a combat veteran, hardened by years of combat and command, and I had been further hardened by the trauma of the conquest and growing up in a ghetto under iron-fisted occupation. But, somewhere along the way, I had gone soft, I suppose. I was feeling things about this last operation, and about the impact it had had on my comrades. I didn't feel bad in the slightest about killing my enemies, whether they be Japanese or Britannian, singularly or in batches. I felt no need to engage in a fair fight or warn the enemy before I attacked. I felt no regret about killing the wounded in the subway station either. None of those men would have survived for long, and letting them bleed out and suffer would have been far worse than giving them a quick death. I had been initially appalled by what I had so carefully planned out, and the sheer amount of blood and pulped flesh had been shocking as well. After all, it had been years since I'd last stood watch on the Rhine. As time went by, that initial shock from the scent of blood and shit leaking from perforated bowels faded, but I still couldn't bring myself to feel happy about the mission I had so carefully conducted. As I tried to pin down exactly what it was about the plan that was making me feel somehow off, I kept my eyes open and an ear to the ground, carefully trying to gather up every hint of the reaction to the Shinjuku bombing, as it had already come to be called. As I'd expected, the other gangs had smelled the blood in the water and set upon the remnants of the Kokirikai mercilessly, avenging past defeats on the formerly rising gang and seizing as much territory and assets as they could. In doing so, a half-dozen gang wars broke out between the new neighbors, with alliances and counter-alliances forming and dissolving every day. As November drew to a close and December dawned, the gang violence showed no signs of stopping or slowing down. Despite the building's collapse, someone had managed to find the notice I'd left in the ruins of Shinjuku Gyomei Station, or someone had found one of the half-dozen other copies I distributed in the vicinity the next day, in case the original had been buried under tons of brick and concrete. While the initial bombing had gone almost unnoticed by the Britannians for hours, one of the notices had made its way into the hands of a reporter by the name of Diethard Reed, who had managed to blow up the story to the point where it was on the front page of the main Tokyo settlement newspaper the next day. Lord Kuehl had been compelled by his superiors, public opinion, his own pride, or some combination of the three to organize a press conference on the bombing. While I didn't have the opportunity to watch it myself, based on the newspapers Callan brought me after Ashford let out each day, he had done a masterful job avoiding taking responsibility for the attack while heavily hinting that the attack had been carried out by the purist faction. According to the editorials, the whole affair was surprisingly controversial among the movers and shakers of Area 11's government. The military leadership was decrying the rogue purist operation, while the hardliners associated with Prince Clovis's retinue were praising Kuehl as a man who clearly could get things done. The overall verdict was that the purists had gained the affection of Prince Clovis for their efforts to combat the criminals plaguing his fair fief, but had burnt their bridges with the rest of the Britannian military in Area 11. As for the regular Japanese of Shinjuku, there didn't seem to be much of an opinion at all about the bombing either way. Since as far as anybody seemed to know, no civilians had died in the blast, there wasn't the same seething current of grief and rage that Britannian collective punishments inspired. The few people who seemed to have an opinion were generally saying things like good riddance, at least when they were sure no gang members were close enough to hear them talking. Of greater concern to the majority of the people of Shinjuku was the ever-mounting food crisis. While the spiraling gang warfare was concerning, the desperate shortage of food was terrifying. The caloric income of virtually everybody living in Shinjuku was plummeting just as the teeth of winter bit, compounding the physical toll and further weakening immune systems. The winter, everybody knew, would be hard, and many would die of starvation, sickness, or exposure. More than gang fighting, more than the prospect of genocidal Britannians, the Japanese of Shinjuku feared the slow suffocating death by deprivation the Britannians had arranged for them. Perhaps that's my solution. How better to soothe the troubled minds of my comrades than a mission of mercy? The Britannians certainly weren't lacking in food or medicine. The ease with which the rising sun was able to import expired or rejected food from grocery stores proved that well enough. Still, that trickle wouldn't be enough to ward off the specter of starvation, but perhaps ramping the supply up would keep at least some of the population alive and healthy. Healthy enough to take up arms when the time comes.